Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining today. So as Alisa said, we'll get started by talking about authenticity today. And so basically, as part of the community journey, we'll have 3 months, so 3 consecutive workshops that will be covering this topic from different angles. And so I think most of you know that I'm a psychologist by background, so we thought that covering authenticity in a career perspective might be an interesting area to start with. So what I'm going to do is I'll send the materials for today here on the chat, so you have access to it by yourself anyways. You will have some further reading there as well if you're interested. And then I'll walk you through the materials. The reason why I like to do this is then we can engage a bit more here in this online space. So just bear with me for a moment. It should appear for all of you on the chat right now. Actually, it's called Authenticity and Career. It's a PowerPoint presentation. I can see some faces nodding. That's great. So it means that you can see it. What I'm going to do anyways is share my screen for the first couple of slides, which is a bit more about theory. And then when it comes to the activities, I'll stop sharing and then we can come here together and reflect. Juan is here with us today to help with questions and facilitate discussions a little bit. So throughout, if you have any questions, either just unmute and ask, or you can also ask in the chat, and then Juan will make sure that we get to the question as soon as possible. So let's get started. Today we'll speak about authenticity, purpose, and career. You will have access to all these materials. The only thing I would like you to do is please do not share these materials beyond our group, as I also use some of these materials with my company separately. So that would be very helpful. A bit about the group dynamics for today. So we'll speak a little bit about the theory of authenticity from a psychology perspective. I will illustrate in practice, and then we'll have most of the activities will be self-reflective with a bit of a discussion here in the group. So basically, you're welcome to engage on any levels. The theory, I think it's there just for us to understand from the psychology perspective, the concept broadly. I like to illustrate because that's how we get to understand, and self-reflection, that's how hopefully you can internalize some of these concepts yourself. We will stop recording once the theory part is over, so that hopefully we feel comfortable sharing our experiences. And I wanted to share one more thing. Authenticity is quite an abstract concept. We'll be working with it from a psychologist's perspective. But maybe you will find that some concepts, some values are hard to verbalize or are not necessarily explicit and are more on a feelings level, and that's fine. So I just wanted to make sure that, whenever you reflect, if it's more of a feeling rather than something explicit, that's absolutely okay. So authenticity, one of the reasons why we thought it's an interesting concept to talk about from the career perspective is because also during the pandemic, this was a question that arose very many times. How can we be authentic? What is our authentic self? How can we make authentic decisions? How can we be authentic in our communication at the workplace? So this was something quite heavily discussed, particularly during the pandemic, which is interesting because this whole question of how to be authentic became particularly important in a time of a paradigm change, in a time of uncertainty, in a time of a crisis that many of us have never lived before. So I wanted to first share a bit about psychology, authenticity from the developmental psychology perspective. So what does authenticity mean? A couple of things that research shows is that young children at a very young age, children are more sensitive to notions of authenticity. They value originals as compared to duplicates. So if we were to show the original, Facebook cup to a child compared to duplicates, the child would probably choose the original as compared to duplicates. So we tend to choose something that is more original. Research also shows that authenticity does play a role in what we find pleasant, what we find entertaining. And it also seems to drive later along the way in teenage years and adulthood our consumer preferences. We like to taste the original Mexican food. We like to taste or we like to visit the typical house, the typical architecture, the original of a new culture that we perhaps visit. And authenticity on the psychological level seems to be correlated with positive relationships, a subjective sense of well-being. That means that I feel good. It's not about how I report any symptoms of well-being or mental health problem, but how I feel genuinely. And it also seems to be correlated with higher self-esteem, self-compassion, and an ability to regulate our emotions. So it seems to be something really good so far. So if we were to define what authenticity means, we would find, so definitions vary, of course, but what we find is that it means that a person experiences his or her actions as self-authored. It feels something I own. I wanted to do this person. And it also means this ability or this feeling that I'm behaving according to what I believe in. So I act based on my values. I feel that what I think and what I feel is what translates to my actions. So it's self-congruency. And connecting this a little bit to motivation, how motivated we feel during the day, during the month, over the course of a year or a couple of years. And if some of you might have encountered our previous workshop exactly 1 year ago on mental health and well-being, we then spoke about motivation and how we can track motivation. So I'm also linking this a little bit to that. When we think about motivation from the psychology perspective, we can, these terms that you see on the slide would identify different kinds of motivation. We can be intrinsically motivated. It means that our motivation for an activity, for a job, for a career change are based on our values, something that we intrinsically believe in. Identified motivation means that, for example, we work in a team, we are working in a job and we have a boss, and the boss tells us, now we are going to work on climate change related advocacy. And although the goal itself does not come from us, but we believe that the goals are right, and so therefore we identify with the motivation, we feel motivated. And then on the other hand, we might be extrinsically motivated. So that means that we would act based on external rewards like money, like being rewarded, being given an award for something. So that's something external to us. And then we might also be motivated based on an introjective motivation, which is similar to extrinsic motivation. We might be doing something because there's some external reward or resource that we might get after that, and we might not be motivated at all after all if we are amotivated. So I wanted to connect authenticity to these different types of motivation, because it seems to be the case that the more authentic we feel, the more we find that our behavior is based on our feelings and overall values, the more we find that we are intrinsically motivated, the more we find that we can keep going in our everyday job or in our everyday activities without those external rewards. And then to go further, I wanted to show you this quite complex illustration. So this is from McKinsey's most recent report on the future of work and what skills will be needed in the next decade. And without going much in depth, I think to me this really points to the necessity to be speaking about authenticity and how we might base our decisions and our career perspectives a bit more on our values and what our skills ultimately are because of this illustration. So if you have a look, what McKinsey found based on a survey and analysis of skills needed based on 18,000 participants globally is that we will mostly need cognitive, interpersonal, and self-leadership skills. We also have the digital part. To me, that's the one part of these skills that is a bit more hands-on, a bit more practical, looking into programming literacy and data analytics. But the other three, they are all interpersonal skills, or they are all soft skills: critical thinking, communication, mental flexibility, planning, and ways of working. interpersonal, mobilizing systems, working in teams, self-leadership, self-awareness, self-management, entrepreneurship, being able to achieve goals. If this is the trend that we are going to follow in the next decade, then basically to me, this is the best starting point for us to start thinking, okay, how can we make our skills based on our own values, our own experiences, and our own leadership skills from that self-awareness perspective, I guess. You will have the link to the McKinsey article in the end of this slide. So if you're interested, have a read, it's very interesting. Okay, so when I work with clients and when the questions of purpose and authenticity come up, then there's a couple of questions that people very often ask, and I wanted to emphasize or sort of spell them out. Something that I very often hear from people is them saying, I just want to figure out what I really want to do. Another thing is when people say, I'm trying to find out who I really am. And so this is something I would hear from clients from really different cultures and across ages, really. But something from the authenticity perspective that I find is that these questions or these goals are somewhat wrongly phrased, because these have the underlying assumption that we have this one overarching thing that we will want to do in our life, or we are this one person. We're trying to find out this one personality, who we really are and who we will remain being. And when we look at authenticity from the psychology, and particularly the developmental psychology perspective, what we find is that that's not necessarily the case. If you think back to who you were when you were 10 years old, when you were 15 years old, when you're 25, and then depending on whether, if you're a bit older, then you ask yourself when you're 30, when you're 35, you're likely to find that your values changed, maybe your personality has changed massively even. And so when we think about authenticity, I would like that we keep in mind that we are people who do change. And when we are able to appreciate that change, that's how we are able to find out the next best step, the next most self-authentic decision for ourselves. So this whole question of authenticity would relate to how we make career choices, but also how we make relationship choices, how we relate to one another in a social perspective in our personal life. And so once again, let's appreciate the idea that these values change. And it's also fine for us to say that we don't actually want to make authentic decisions. We are fine with sort of fitting into our social network and abiding to rules and norms that come from that. That's okay as well. So the decisions start from the point whether we want to make certain self-reflective choices. So based on all this, the first three questions that I would encourage you to think about is, how do I build in self-reflective practices in my everyday life so that over the course of years and decades, I am able to reflect on changes and I am able to build in whatever I learned in the past so that I now in the present make my self-authentic decision. One practice I personally typically recommend is setting an hour for yourself in your own Google Calendar, Outlook calendar, whatever you use, on a monthly or quarterly basis so that you get a reminder to keep reflecting. You then don't have to use that hour all the time, but it's a reminder to check, okay, how am I doing right now? And then the two other questions, to what extent do I seek approval from others? To what extent do I, so me feeling good, me feeling ready for the next challenge, to what extent does that depend on approval from others? It's another question to reflect on. And to what extent do I know my inner values? To what extent do I understand what I base my decisions on? My decisions are based on approval from others, or there are certain values that I really do find important. In the youth advocacy perspective, I think a good example here is actually climate change advocates, people who decide, well, some of them go to the extent that they change careers entirely so that their career is built on their values, which is advocating against climate change or standing up for sustainability. But we don't have to go to that extent. Chatting with Alisa, no, I think it was Chloe who mentioned the other day, affective altruists. Chloe is another team member from Voices. Effective altruism, building in something about making social good in our everyday life, that's another inner value that we can build into our decision making. Okay, and now heading towards the interactive part of this workshop, I wanted to raise a framework that we are going to use, and I'm just checking the time as well so that we are not running over time. We are going to use this framework when we think about authenticity today, and you will have the reference to the paper that I'm taking this from if you're interested in the research bit as well. So that would be analyzing authenticity based on 3 levels. The first one is historical authenticity. This is about the object's history and its connection to a valued person, place, or an event. So a question that we can ask ourselves, am I the person who I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? To what extent do I connect to my past self? And let me just emphasize here that historical authenticity is not about remaining the same person. It's about having the connectedness to the person who we were a couple of years ago. It's about making it a linear story, a narrative that I can tell how I became from that 5-year-old to the 25-year-old. The next level, categorical authenticity, the extent to which an entity conforms to the existing beliefs of a particular category. I'm a PhD student personally. To what extent am I like the other PhD students? I'm a Voices member. To what extent am I similar to other Voices members? How do I differ from them? And here, when we think about categorical similarity or difference, an important point is that we don't have to be similar to all our different identities or categories where we belong. The question is this something important to us? There are people who personally find it very important to belong to a certain group. For them to be similar to other community members is really quite important. And to others, belonging to one category is not that important. Here, what's important is that we reflect on whether categorical authenticity is something that matters to us. And if it is, then we can keep reflecting on it. And then thirdly, values authenticity, the consistency between the entity's internal states and external expressions. So that's about the I feel, I think, and I behave. Do I behave and communicate in the same way across contexts? Do I behave and communicate according to what I actually think? An example to this would be, I failed an exam. How do I present this failure to my parents, to my friends, to my partner on social media? To what extent do these different ways of communication overlap or not? Okay, so 3 dimensions, historical, categorical, and values authenticity. 2 further points here. One is that authenticity really differs across cultures. Authenticity in more individual-oriented or individualist cultures is something that really matters. In cultures where a sense of belonging or more collectivist cultures, authenticity would be less important. And this is something important to bear in mind because our self-reflection will depend on this. And then the other point that I wanted to make is about leadership. So if you did manage to read that article that we recommended for you to read in the for this workshop about authenticity and leadership, that article very interestingly pointed out the fact that being authentic, being transparent can also sometimes backfire in a leadership position. Transparently communicating about our weaknesses, sometimes it does work and sometimes it doesn't. And this I wanted to point out because, again, authenticity is about the decision that you make for yourself as to what extent you want your decisions and behavior to be based on your own values. And one can decide that I want that my whole life is based on my values, and that's a good decision. And someone can say, in my personal life with the closest ones, I want to be the authentic me, but then at the workplace, sometimes I do want to conform because that's what feels comfortable for me. And that's also a good decision. It's about the idea that you make this decision for yourself and you are aware of how and why you make these decisions, okay? So just one case study to illustrate all of this. This is a client of mine from the past. Of course, details changed so that it remains anonymous, but let's call her Anne. Let's say she's 31 years old and she's an investment banker. And so this person was seeking a psychologist because as an investment banker, she was at the position that she was no longer a junior person in the field. She wanted to become on a more senior level. She wanted to take on leadership positions. But then she also felt that she actually very much cares about social impact investing, which her company is not doing. And this basically meant to her that if she wanted to get to that leadership position in the firm, she would have to leave the social impact investment she would have to cancel all her plans on that, which would be according to her values, but then she would get to the leadership position in the firm, or she would quit the firm and restart her career. And then she would working on things that are completely aligned with her values, which would mean being more involved in social impact investment. And so here she was in this stage where choosing one or the other thing would lead to very different outcomes. One would be based on a power position, external approval. I'm being promoted to a leadership position and I am being approved by my firm. One career choice. The other career choice, I quit my firm and I go with my values and I go into social impact investing. Both are uncertain. We don't know whether she would succeed in one or the other, or perhaps in both, but she had this dilemma. I'm not going to tell you what she decided to do. I wanted to tell you this case study because I think it nicely represents the kind of decisions that we all have to make every now and then. And both are good decisions, right? Like, it's not that she would be a terrible person because of choosing one or the other. Both are fine, but this is the dilemma that we are facing today. Okay, I will show you this authenticity scale, and after this we can stop sharing because we'll start with the interactive bit. I'm just going to show these to you. I just would like that you read them and sort of think whether you agree or disagree for yourself on these statements. And then the next 6 questions. Okay, so I stop sharing here. So this scale, the authenticity scale, it's mainly used in research, and it's trying to measure whether, it's trying to check whether we can measure authenticity, whether we can set up questions that would be a good measure of that. I just wanted to show you the questions to once again show you examples as to how we can reflect on authenticity.